I think, okay, it is the appointed hour now. Um, so we got, I think, a pretty good number of people who have gathered. So I'm just going to kick us off, and we can start slowly to allow people to kind of come in. So hi to everyone who is already here, and thank you to those of you who listened to our pre-show small talk. Sorry that I don't know how to work the Zoom kind of green room function. Um, for those of you who are new to Equator, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the magazine. And then I'm going to introduce our lovely guests, and then we'll get started. One bit of housekeeping for those of you who'd like to ask questions. I think we're going to talk for about 45 minutes, maybe 40 to 45 minutes, and I'm definitely going to try and let Nagma and Arang lead the way, and I will try not to be too present. And if you have questions that come up during the conversation, you can put them into the chat window, and we three panelists will see your questions. Everyone else will not see them, as far as I'm aware. And if these things are relevant to what's happening during the conversation, then maybe Arang or Nagma will address them. But then I will kind of make a note of a few questions that touch on things that we haven't previously discussed, and we can ask those at the end, and then we'll wrap up, at around the hour mark. So thank you everyone for coming. This is the one of the first round of online events that we're putting on at Equator. Equator, if for those of you who are not familiar, is a new magazine that started at the end of last year. We began publishing at the start of November 2025. We are a collective of international writers and editors. We are set up as a nonprofit. We are at the moment an online magazine, but we also offer digital and print subscriptions. And I would encourage you to visit our website at equator.org. And if you're not already on our mailing list, please sign up. And if you would like to support conversations like this in the future and fantastic pieces of the sort that we have been publishing by Arang and Nagma and various others, you can sign up to join. So I won't go on too much more about that, but it's at equator.org. Now let me introduce our panelists. People are still kind of coming in, but I think this is a good time to start. So I'm very happy to be joined tonight by two esteemed Equator contributors and two of the most incisive scholars of contemporary Iran. Nagma Sorabi is the Charles Corky Goodman Professor of Middle East History and the Director for Research at the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis University. She's currently working on a book about the revolutionary generation in Iran titled The Intimate Lives of a Revolution, Iran 1979. She's also the author of a very interesting Substack, which I recommend you Google and check out, which is, among other things, I think a really rich kind of window onto what's being written inside Iran or conversations that are happening inside Iran. Nagma can talk a bit more about this, I'm sure, as we go on. We've been fortunate to publish now two of her pieces in Equator. Most recently, in the first part of a symposium that we've done about the war. We're going to have more of this coming out over the next few days. We've got other contributors who are also going to be writing. Um, Arang Keshavarzian is professor of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at New York University. His most recent book is Making Space for the Gulf, Histories of Regionalism and the Middle East. And Arang has just published a fantastic piece in the New York Review of Books called Iran Transformed that takes in both the protests and the war. And I'm sure we're going to be talking quite a lot about that. I don't know how to post the link or anything on Zoom, but if you go and Google it, I'm sure you can find it. So hello to Arang and Nagma, and hello to everyone who has now joined us. I'm sorry if there's any speed bumps in getting on board. I'll let Arang and Nagma just say hello now.
Uh, Hello, everyone. It's really lovely to be here, and thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you to Equator for inviting us, and thank you all for joining.
It's really nice, and I'm really excited. I find it very strange to do these events because you know people are listening, but you can't hear or see them. So, people feel free to put responses or anything in the chat to let us know that you are out there and alive. Um, so before we started, I told Nagma and Arang both that I wanted to begin with a kind of speculative question. And my speculative question was based on something I've noticed in reading about the protests that took place in January, which we're going to talk about a lot, and of course in reading about the war, and generally reading about the Islamic Republic. Um, there was a tendency to foreground these dates in the recent past that serve as kind of milestones to help us understand the present. So to say, look, if you want to know what's happening now, you have to understand the protests that took place in 2022, or you have to understand the protests that took place in 2019, et cetera, et cetera. So I wanted to ask both Arang and Nagma, if you had to choose a date from which to begin the story that leads us to today, what would you choose?
I think we decided that I will go.
It makes sense. It makes sense.
Yes. Well, it's going to be 1979 for me always and forever. But aside from the fact that I'm obsessed with that date, there's three interrelated reasons that I'm going to quickly mention. The first one is that it's very important to remember the revolution and the Islamic Republic of Iran are connected, but they are different phenomenon. And the Islamic Republic of Iran is born out of the revolution, and that's a very important thing to keep in mind. And as such, its DNA includes this heterogeneity of this revolutionary movement that included leftists, secularists, nationalists, Islamists, and all of these people, because there's a difference between the revolution and the Islamic Republic, in the sense that revolution happens in February of 1979, the Constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran is approved in a referendum in December of 1979. In that time period, a lot of these forces that create that this heterogeneous force that went into the revolution actually made its way into the Constitution, but also into the way in which politics is understood and politics is practiced in the Islamic Republic of Iran. That's the first thing. The second and related issue is that in some ways you can say that the history of the Islamic Republic in the past 47 years really is a history of how to deal with this heterogeneity, how to deal with these multiple ideas and thoughts that went into the revolution and then went into the DNA of the Islamic Republic as the Islamic Republic itself is changing. In other words, as it tries, actually often through violence, increasingly through violence, trying to shed its revolutionary past, right? We have to understand what that means, what that interaction is. Why is it constantly trying to kind of get rid of the revolution that gave birth to it? And I say that because one of the things that Arang and I talked about, and I hope Arang mentions it also, is that we're both really struck by the way in which people like Tom Cotton, Lindsey Graham, but just so overall the discourse on Iran today treats the past 47 years as if the Islamic Republic was born and then the Islamic Republic is here today. And the analogy that I can think of is this whole idea of when, after the Iraq War, when people would be like, for millennia, the Shiis and Sunnis have been fighting with each other, right? That flattening that is happening is on purpose in order to say what you think, what you see, and what you feel today was what this thing was in 1979 and beyond. But it's not. It's gotten through multiple transformations, and I hope Oran can actually address some of those. The last reason I picked 1979, if when we look at it from the perspective of political actors, what the Iranians call nizam, the system, and think about the way in which the revolution has gone into the DNA of the system, from the perspective of the population also, 1979 is always, consciously or not, at the forefront of their minds, and it determines the multiplicity of not just protests, but different kinds of mobilizations that is constantly happening in Iran. The population is constantly making demands on the system. A kind of thinking and a kind of action that is born out of this actually genuinely popular, this revolution that was based on ideas like social justice and a whole series of other um, demands. And just to make that clear, what I mean by that is not the way in which the Western press treats every time people go out into the streets in Iran, which is like, oh, here's a revolution again. People are in the streets. Here's a revolution. You know, one of the weirdest ironies of every time in the recent years that there's been a protest, and as the monarchists and Mr. Pahlavi have gone up and up, one of the ironies, of course, is like, why do you keep saying this is a revolution when a revolution is what led you to be in the place that you are today? But the reason people keep, holding on to that is that it has meaning. It has a very particular meaning to the population itself. And I want to end by giving you a very concrete example that kind of it goes into Orang's first book, and what Orang has written about is that one of the narratives people give for why January 8th and 9th, so many people, and Orang writes about this in his New York Review of Books piece, multi-generations, grandmothers and children and everybody on January 8th and 9th went into the streets and then were massacred by the state, is that they responded to the call by Reza Pahlavi. That is, yes, Reza Pahlavi made a call and people went out. That you can't deny it, that. But it's important to remember, to ask ourselves why that happened, particularly when Reza Pahlavi in June of 2025, when there had been a war going on, had told people this is your Berlin Wall moment, come out, and nobody did. And to me, one of the reasons for why this happened at this moment has to do with the fact that in December 28, the way in which the protests started, so 10 days before January 8, is that the bazaar shut down, that the bazaar went on strike. And I think because of the way in which 79 is just so deeply embedded in the way in which people think about mobilization in Iran, is that whether they were for the Islamic Republic or not, there's this sense that where the bazaar goes, then you're at the end point of a revolutionary moment, because that is the narrative of 1979. And I think the fact that bazaar started these protests on December 28th, gave people a sense that, okay, much like 79, when Bazaar goes on strikes and enters a revolutionary moment, we know then that this is basically the end is coming, that this is what it signaled, and people went out. So I think 79 is just for the population, for the state, and for analysts, something that is constantly determining what is happening, even at this moment that we're in.
So that's very interesting. Thank you, Nagma. I mean, I think I hear you saying in a way that almost unintentionally, this most recent movement or round of protests kind of spoke the language of the revolution, or seemed to people to signify a return to the sort of spirit of 1979. I mean, I think we'll get into this particularly as we talk about some of the internal dynamics, both within the sort of government and politics and society more generally. I'm very intrigued, though, by this idea, Nagma, that you've put forth that, in a way, the Islamic Republic has been engaged in its rounds of conflict with these social protest movements, with almost trying to kind of shed the burden of the revolution. I think this is a nice segue into Arang's answer. For those who have come a bit late, I've asked both of my guests to sort of pick for us a kind of year from which narrating the present becomes possible, or maybe a year that we can't understand the present without. Nagma has said 1979, a classic. And now over to Arang.
Sure, I'm definitely not going to argue with Nagma and her comments and analysis of how 1979 has cast a shadow on events all the way into 2026 are absolutely on point. And Jonathan, your gloss on that is on the mark. Just one little one-liner, and then I'll talk to about my year. Is that I mean, we've sort of forgotten about this, but when the merchants, the money lenders, and the bazaar went on protest in December 28th, 29th, 30th of December, it's striking that unlike industrial workers and nurses and teachers, The government really struck a very conciliatory tone in those opening week, let's say, and part of that is probably related to that these were merchants. They thought of them as supporters of the revolution, a part of their social base, and they understood that this is we have to treat them differently than we treat working class peoples and other groups. And I think that is shaped by this the collective memory of 1979. So on the one hand, while I absolutely agree with Nahwa that we have to think about the Islamic Republic as dynamic, as not static, as in a sense continuously being reproduced at every turn, Jonathan, your question asks us to pinpoint, a particular inflection points, and you rightfully point out there have been many moments many years or junctures that we could kind of highlight. But if I, in a sense, had to pinpoint one, I would go with 2009. For the audience members and from ordinary Iranians, 2009 or 1388 kind of resonates because it should be on people's minds because this was the first major nationwide protests that Iran experienced after 1979. These were what we call the Green Movements. These were kind of intimately connected to the presidential elections that the opposition candidate or the reformist candidate and their supporters challenged. This is when Ahmadinejad is re-elected for a second term, but the reformist camp, the people involved in this Green Movement, challenged these results. This is a kind of a moment of a tectonic plate. These were not only just major protests in the name of where is my vote, but this is also a moment, or the months and years immediately after 2009, are the moment where really the avenues of participation in formal institutionalized politics are radically narrowed, really kind of limited. So if from the late 90s or even the mid 1990s until 2009, there was enough space for oppositional voices to organize, to articulate platforms, to even win elections, such as Khatami did in 1997. With 2009, that space in organized politics really shrinks, and many leading reformists are thrown into prison. Their newspapers are shut down. Their social space is really restricted, and there's a real clampdown. Now, nothing in Iran is permanent. So after a few years, people learned how to negotiate and push through, and there are different moments of ebbs and flows of more space and less space, and pragmatists come to power, and so on and so forth. So all of that is true. For me, 2009, however, and this is what I talk about to a large extent in my New York Review of Books piece, is also significant because it's an inflection point in the political economy of Iran. 2009 to say 2012 is a critical moment where two things happen. One, Iran initiates, and it's not talked about much, but good political economists on Iran have all discussed this. This is a moment where Iran goes through a radical privatization initiative, where the idea is too much of the economy is controlled by the public sector, state-owned enterprises, and to initiate entrepreneurship, create jobs, increase exports, all of those things, we need to privatize. And interestingly, the reformists adopted this, if I can use the word, neoliberal kind of strategy initially. But in the hands of Ahmadinejad and with the kind of tutelage and support of the former leader, Ali Khamenei, the privatization moment became an opportunity to shift a whole series of important state assets, mines, petrochemicals, industries, into the hands of what Nahma just called the Nizam. This is the section. So if the Islamic Republic is divided between unelected branches, the supreme leader, and a whole series of councils, it also has what Iranians call the government, or the Dawlat, which is the elected segment of government, president, parliament, cabinet, and so on and so forth. But with the privatization, those state-owned enterprises shifted into the hands of what we call parastatal organizations, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, religious foundations, pensions, the Basij, and so on and so forth. So huge swaths of the national wealth and assets get transferred over to this unelected, unaccountable, opaque segment of the state. what Iranians usually call nizam or hukumat. So
You,
for me, 2000,
Arang, in your New York Review piece, you referred to this as the non-governmental public sector, which I thought was a nice turn of phrase. I know it's not yours originally.
yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's the only way we can. It's a non-governmental public sector. People have come up with lots of strange ways to describe it. But basically, what happens is all of a sudden, this unelected Nizam portion of the regime has enormous control, not only over guns, but huge swaths of the economy. They already were involved in the economy, and there was crony capitalism and all that kind of stuff before. But this is, in a sense, supercharged. The last point I'll just quickly say, this all intersects and dovetails with the Obama era sanctions that targeted not only oil exports and imports, but also Iran's financial system, including the central bank, which really made export, import, moving of dollars in and out of the country incredibly difficult. And therefore, those groups who it created, in a sense, a black market in which the IRGC, the Basij, and those who were close to power in Iran had a privileged and specialized position in the political economy. And for me, that in a sense sends Iran down this pathway where you have massive inequality, where you have certain groups that have really control all levers of the economy. And because of privatization and austerity budgets and the sanctions, you have massive immiseration and impoverishment of most portions of the society. And this is what leads to these kind of cycles of protest: 2017, 2019, 2022, and then in December. Of course, each one has different social groups, different specific demands, but they are rooted in this restructuring of the political economy after 2009.
So you thank you, Arang. That's very good. You've mentioned a few things that I think we're going to pick up on. One of them, I think, and this will get us, I think, nicely into our first or our next subject of conversation, which is the killing of the supreme leader and the anointment of his successor. But what I'm taking away from what you said and things that I've read is that since 2009, you have sort of a series of processes maybe come into start to begin. One of them, which I think we'll return to, is maybe the end or the last throes of reformism as a kind of political movement, and maybe that's the beginning of the end is the better way to put it. Um, I think interestingly, in terms of what Nagma has said, and maybe you guys can help the audience understand this a bit better, something that's intriguing to the outside observer of these movements in Iranian politics, you mentioned the Green Movement in 2009, is the extent to which they are sort of intra-revolutionary conflicts, right? That the Mousavi, who is the losing candidate in 2009, was very much, as I understand it, part of the revolutionary cohort. Um, I know this starts to change when Ahmadinejad comes on the scene, and you start to have people who don't necessarily have that background. So you have the end of this reformist period, or the beginning of the end, maybe, of this reformist period, marrying with the American sort of sanctions regime at the same time as this kind of privatization and securitization, so to speak, of the economy begins. I have some more questions about what that sort of securitized economy looks like in practice, but let's talk about Khamenei and go to Nagma here in terms of how to express the significance of his death, to what extent maybe outside of the dynamic of this war, the regime was involved in debating and planning the succession, whether his assassination, Khamenei's assassination, is what has led to the appointment of his son as his successor. And then I think something that's very interesting, or something I'd like to hear you guys talk about, is who are the forces within the regime, or the segments within the regime, who would be pushing Mujtaba forward as the next supreme leader. I think in the press there's a sense of, oh, he's the candidate of the IRGC or hardliners or people who want to be able to push him around. I don't know whether any of that is correct or not. So, Nagma, let me go to you to think about the significance of his death and maybe in light of his connection to 1979.
I think the question of what is the significance of his death needs a follow-up question, which is for whom, right? Um, Again, we're talking about a country of 91 million. We're talking about a very complex political system. As Orang laid out, the political economy is also very, very complicated. So number one, right, the easiest part that everybody knows, and we can just start there. For a wide segment of the population, his death was symbolically and otherwise a glimmer of hope, right? And it's important to remember again that January 8 and 9, the government, let's not get into the numbers, but we know they over 2 days they massacred over 7,000 people, right? Other people say it's 30, 20, 40, doesn't matter, 7,000 and above, right? And that is still fresh in
And
very
this
a
is
lot of people's mind.
significantly a policy with this is his policy, right? This kind of repression is coming from or authorized by the supreme leader in this case.
Um, I think we need to answer the first
Yeah,
question you asked
sorry.
and
I'm
then
sorry. I'm
answer
sorry.
this
Yeah, yeah.
question. I say that because, and I don't want to speak for Orang, but I will, which is that Orang and I are our view of the Iranian political system is not that this is a pyramid. It's not a totalitarian state. It's not one man on top who dictates everything that happens. And I'm gonna that say this much and let Orang actually get into that. But just to answer the question that you asked, he is the supreme leader of the country, right? If he was not okay with it happening, it wouldn't have okay. But there is a big difference between saying that and saying everything that happens in Iran. Ali Khamenei determined that, and now that he was gone, we have a massive transformation of the political system. And there's actually, we don't have, because Iran, let's remember there is a war still going on, and that he was killed on the first day of this massive, massive war on Iran in the region, right? But I go back to the question that you asked. There's a Substack called Fact Nome, and they basically fact check a lot of things. And one of the things they put out a couple of days ago, which answers specifically this question of how much this matters to the system, when moving out away from the population to the nizam, to the system, is that as everybody knows, on that Saturday when the war started, internet shuts down in Iran for the most part. It basically just shuts down. And so they did a very interesting thing. They did an analysis of close to 45,000 posts that did come out of Iran in the first 72 hours of the war. This means they had a perfectly controlled group. This is anybody who was posting on Telegram at the moment was part of the Nizam. They were part of the system because other people were not allowed to do that. And they did word clouds and they did an analysis of what was happening. And they were surprised. And they said the most surprising and unexpected thing is that the death of Khamenei was just not that important for these official system based telegram channels and other kinds. They were focused on the question of the war. They were focused on war propaganda, and they have these beautiful graphs where basically the word Khamenei or the word succession is this very low flat line over the 72 hours since he is killed, but the word strikes, bombs, hits, all of these things are spiking much higher and higher. If to the system his death was a blow, right? It would logically make sense that this is not the graph that we would see. This is not the word cloud that we would see from this very 45,000 tweets. And that has to do with what we've already said and has to do with the fact that while the timing of this war might have not been pinpointed, that this war was coming and that Khamenei was going to die at some point, whether in the war and in other ways, was planned for. I think as in outside of Iran, we have a tendency, and I don't know where this tendency comes from, where we think if we don't know something, Iranians also don't know about it. Or if something is a mystery to us, like, oh, Moshtaba Khamenei is a mystery. Moshtaba Khamenei is a mystery to us, but it does not make him a mystery. It's just we do not have the information. And our lack of knowledge does not impose either lack of planning or lack of knowledge or not having predicted multiple steps on the part of the Nizam and here IRGC and all the other parts that go into building up the system. So I would say while the death, the assassination of Khamenei brought in a moment of real joy for a huge part of the population that night as they were living under massive bombardment that had started that morning. And let's not forget that one of the first news that comes out is that the US, now the US, it's clear that it was the US, that bombs fall on this primary school. And they think the number is somewhere between 170, 185, primarily primary school girls, kids actually, killed. As that is happening, people do come out. They are joyful, they are happy. But the next day, those who felt like this was their supreme leader and he was assassinated in a foreign strike also came out into the streets. And that was their reaction. But for the Nizam itself, my sense from Faknama and everything else was that would have been better if it hadn't happened. They had a plan if it did happen. You want to pick it up?
Yeah, if I can just build on some of those points. I mean, this point that we shouldn't think of the Islamic Republic as a deeply hierarchical pyramid, right? It's in fact not the Shah's regime. This is the almost antithesis of the Shah's regime. And from what I know about Venezuela, it's very different from Venezuela, where you had a party structure that said, okay, someone is president, you can remove them, and the vice president takes over. In the Iranian case, when we look at it, it's really a deeply networked and kind of nodal system where there are all of these different pockets of political power distributed, intersecting with one another. So on the one hand, it does create rivalry and competition. And this is maybe one way to think about, a lot of people this past week were like, oh, the regime hasn't announced the supreme leader, right? It's taken 7 days, 8 days. For me, that wasn't that the regime was kind of hamstrung or collapsing, but it was like, oh, this is politics in Islamic Republic. Different factions, different groups, different even families are fighting over how is this new regime or this new state going to look like, and trying to make sure that they are still within the confines of the apparatus. And then the other way it came up this past week is when Iran started shooting rockets at different countries around the Persian Gulf region and so forth, there was a sense, and even the officials mentioned that this is a decentralized kind of military response. But that is all sort of in keeping with the structure of the Islamic Republic being highly decentralized and fluid. So this fluidity is not weakness, but it's part of the dynamism that, in a sense, Naghmeh articulated at the beginning. And I would encourage us, I mean, I'm not talking to Washington, D.C., but for ordinary observers to be cognizant that there is actually contestation in politics, not with the full pluralism of Iranian society. I'm not daft, I'm not making that argument, but even with what we call pro-regime society and factions, members of society and the economy, even within that confines, there are differences. And these differences and these struggles have been, in a sense, recharged and unleashed with the killing of Ali Khamenei, and with now his son, who I'm going to go on the record. I'm comfortable saying that he would not have become the supreme leader had it not been for the U.S. and Israeli war on Iran. He was not. He was actually. He was far weaker before. I forgot what day this war started. Whenever this war started, then after it started, he was, in a sense, his position was strengthened because the regime felt that this was existential, and we need a transition and continuity figure. Sorry,
Well,
Jonathan.
no, that's okay. I mean, I would pick up from what both of you have said then, and possibly float the idea without wanting to oversimplify in the other direction, that the choice of the successor and his identity as the choice of the successor is maybe less significant than we have seen it described. Um, what seems paradoxical to me, and I want to get into the kind of divisions within the society more broadly, is that one thing that comes out of this conversation we're having is a sense that though it is not a top-down hierarchical system, uh, that the shape of the future state is up in the air. I think, obviously, and in some ways, in an existential sense of, will it be divided, as some people have speculated. Um, but at the same time, what both of you have said is that because the nizam, so to speak, is networked, is decentralized in some ways, um, that changes at the top and a kind of what I would call a kind of Kremlinology of, well, okay, how does this Ayatollah relate to the original revolutionaries, to reformists, to principalists? Um, how do you think, Nagma? Part of what I think I've appreciated so much in reading your Substack and reading the pieces you've done for Equator is your attention to the voices of maybe more ordinary Iranians, or ordinary Iranians at least, who are writing. Um, how do you see the composition of opinion inside the country in light of, not so much who has power to shape the new state, but maybe the main kind of currents or divisions in terms of the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think before I answer that, one thing that I want all of us to keep in mind is what we said at the top of the hour, which is that the internet's been shut down since the war started on February 28th, the historian tells the political scientist. But and I say that is to say we're getting bits and pieces right now, so we don't have the full picture to answer Jonathan's question, but also because one of the things that Orang said, and I want to just remind ourselves of that, is that it's not just that the Islamic Republic changes, it's just we have to remember war changes people, right? I mean, and something this intense is going to change people. So I don't want to make any assumptions about what is going to happen moving forward. But just to give a sense of what we saw before the war started and then the trickle of ideas that are coming out, and this is what I wrote for Equator, as you know, Jonathan, because you edited it. But, I think um, what I said in the piece, and I want to say it again, is that we do rightly focus on the way in which war kills people and the way in which war destroys infrastructure and the way in which war you blow up oil depots and all of these things. But what war has done also is that it actually just kills ideas and it doesn't kill ideas because it kills just people. It kills ideas because it takes away the space in which people have to exchange ideas and to argue with each other. And we're talking about, the way in which cafe culture in Iran really is hopefully will continue to be a culture in which people with different opinions came together and duked it out. And one of the things that for me was really remarkable after the January and 8 and 9 massacres, up until our access and people's access to these spaces in Iran shut down, was the way in which people made a point, and I'm talking, when I say people, I'm talking about the intellectual class, like people, which in Iran is a very expansive idea of who counts as an intellectual, right? Um, but they actually made a real effort to be in the same spaces and to argue with one another, as opposed to the polarization of public ideas and thought that we tend to see outside of Iran, particularly among its very diaspora. But this was really important because my sense of what was happening in between January 8th and February 28th was this almost this will to get out of this binary of you are either pro-regime or you are pro-monarchy, like willing it by saying we can come together and we can duke it out. And in that duking out, in the form of sitting in a space together and talking, we can start to think about charting new paths and new ideas forward. And this is not just, there was a lot of talk, for example, about what does republicanism mean? And I think that idea came out because people were like, okay, we know people have a very good idea of what the Islamic Republic is, and we know people have a sense of what the monarchy is. The idea that needs more discussion, more defining, more back and forth was this idea of the republic. And so there were multiple sessions and reading groups and associational get-togethers that had been planned that were cut short by the war to come and have this debate, right? Or this even you said, it was the beginning of the end of reformism. And I want to kind of put an asterisk next to that and say, yes, reformism as a political faction that had a presence in various elections and newspapers and all of that. Yes, absolutely. But I'm just repeating what Orang wrote in his New York Review of Book article, which is that we still have to then say, why is it that right after the January 8th and 9th massacres, they came and they rounded up the reformists, right? If reformism dead, if the idea is dead, if it doesn't matter, why would the state actually spend any money or effort basically rounding up reformists and holding them for a while and having them let go? It's because I think whether or not reformism as a political movement is dead, the ideas on which it was based, right? That you do not have to choose between Islamic Republic and monarchy. You can think about it's what they people call the revolution of second thought, right? That you can think through these ideas and the way in which reformism kind of made certain ideas principle to itself. That's the ideas just don't go away just like that, just because a platform went away. And so like I think it's really, really important that as schools are bombed, as cafes are bombed, as libraries are bombed, as all these gathering of social spaces are gone, we have to wait and see what comes out of the rubble. I don't think the ideas are going to go away, but I do think we don't know. Maybe people are still having these debates, and we just have to wait and see. I'm going to say one last point and pass it over to Orang, which is um, I make this mistake, and I just saying it out loud so that I don't make it a mistake anymore. But tend to forget that the state also has its own intellectuals, and they are also engaged in a battle of ideas, as Orang pointed out, not just within themselves, but also with society. That there is an act of persuasion, right? That there is an attempt at persuading people to come over to your ideas, and state intellectuals actually are not these scarecrow figures that you can just knock down, right? They are taking part in these gray zones of neither state nor society, but in this mix. I told Lang I'm not going to use the Habermasian public sphere, and I'm not going to use it. But if there's another word for it, I would use that word. But I think they're also in that mix of ideas and in this attempt to kind of come up with different ways for the Islamic Republic to either transform or transition.
No, that's a very, very good point. I think it's hard, I mean, maybe I'm getting out over my skis here a bit, but I think it's difficult for people living outside Iran, or any society like Iran, I think, to understand the ways in which politics plays out, that don't necessarily resemble, an American or a European style. Um, Arang, I want to pivot off something Nagma has said, and she's made this point that after January 8th and 9th, there was this renewal of conversations, and maybe, I don't want to speculate, maybe people were thinking, okay, well, look, these protests have not dislodged the regime, but we can see perhaps that its days are numbered, or that there is a new chance to have a talk about what kind of state or what kind of society we'd like to be in the future. Um, do you have a sense, two-part question, I guess, um, what some of those ideas were? Nagma has mentioned some of them, um, but also how, again, this is very speculative. How has the war possibly shifted the balance there? Are there ideas that maybe of a more liberal or progressive sort that were bubbling up after January, and now we might worry that they're gone. What's your
Yeah.
sense of that?
If I can take the second part first, because Nachman's the optimist here. I'll play the role of the pessimist. Um, uh, it is really bleak this past week because this kind of the social dynamism that we've seen for many years, but really, emerge, the questioning, self-critique, doubts that were very honestly articulated these past few weeks has really been suffocated, primarily by bombs and missiles. But we also, let me just make sure for your viewers, they understand this has also been a moment where the staunch supporters of the Islamic Republic have checkpoints on the streets, on highways and alleys. We don't know all the details, but I worry about summary arrests, student groups, journalists, and so forth being swept up in a whole series of new sweeps, already happening, but probably only intensifying. It's a trite point, but war is not a it's never a good time to engage in political debate and discussion and nonviolent strategies. But what I heard, and thanks in part to Nachman's wonderful Substack, but is that there were questions about, well, why did we assume that the Islamic Republic was so weak, right? So people started questioning, well, why is this regime so bloodthirsty? So there was some actually really kind of attempts to analyze what the Islamic Republic was. If there is this significant group who wants a transition, and that's the term that you would use, a transition away from the Islamic Republic, there was a real discussion, well, what does a referendum look like? Do we need a leader, Reza Pahlavi, to organize this transition? Or what Nachman said, what is the difference between republicanism and constitutional monarchy? It was all of these sorts of discussions and doubts and genuine questions that people were asking themselves, and I'm sure they still are. It's just you can't have those discussions on social media or in a cafe or in the university setting, like you were having, both before the protest but after the protest. So I think that's there's a lot of hard work in organizing, right? And but you also need not only the resources to do that organizing, not only a certain degree of political and legal civil rights to do that organizing. You need this political space, and that's for me, amongst the many different tragedies we have around the world and in Iran. This is one of the primary ones. For me, at least this week, is that this space, you can just feel it shrink. You can feel that the proverbial oxygen being pulled out of the room. It's not, Iranians are resilient. All of these forces, including the reformists, younger reformists, new generations, will be back on the stage when this war ends and with this new young leader. But it's going to be a new set of struggles, right?
Let me try and use that to shift slightly into maybe the second part of a question like this, which is that because of in the wake of the protests and the role that Reza Pahlavi played putatively, there's been a lot of attention to the politics of the diaspora. It occurs to me, as someone who is not at all expert in this subject, that the situation you're describing, Arang, in which oxygen is taken away not just by war but by repression in a country, the more that perhaps political debate and energy flows to the diaspora, or the diaspora has resources and energy and initiative. I'm gonna anticipate something Nagma said earlier, that there is not one diaspora. Not everyone in the Iranian diaspora is a well-to-do monarchist in Los Angeles. How, as scholars, do you think about the diaspora and its role, and maybe what role will it play in shaping this new future of the state?
Shall I start, and then Nachman can pick up this, change it up? The diaspora question is a challenging one for me, because up until a few years ago, we never used this term for Iranians. they were just always described as being in exile. But now students tell me I'm part of the diaspora. So
Oh,
it's taken
wow.
me I'm a little bit flat-footed on this whole topic. Let me just say a few things. Not only is the diaspora diverse and varied, because obviously generationally, but also Iranians have arrived at different moments across this past 45 years. So some have more intimate relations with post-revolutionary Iran, some don't. There's a lot of different factors, class differences, and so forth. But I do want to emphasize that not all parts of this diaspora have the same platforms. So I think some of your audience probably is aware of this, but just for those who aren't, the let's call it the pro-monarchist vocal platforms or segments of the diaspora are vocal in part because they have the social media resources on social media, on international TV and satellite TV to push this argument. So we have to be cognizant of why certain parts of the diaspora it seems to be occupying a disproportionate space. And the other last point I'll just make is we also have to remember that these diasporas are operating in the last, let's say, 5 years or so, or more, actually, 8 years, in which they're in a world where, in the United States, Canada, Europe, where um, democracy, social justice, liberalism are in decline, right? In most, I'm simplifying things, and the language of strong leaders, the language of white nationalism, and is really, really powerful, right? And to me, part of the reason there's almost like a hand in glove situation where Pahlavism, which is really based on a very racialized understanding of the Iranian nation, fits very comfortably with notions of white nationalism because the Pahlavi logic for the last 80, 90 years has been, oh, we are the original Aryans. Not only are we white, but we are actually the founders of white nationalism. So there are these weird, and I'm not an expert on this, but weird synergies between Pahlavi national thought and, for simplifying, kind of this new racialized eugenics kind of understandings of nation and politics that has proliferated over the past decade or so across the world and the United States quite dramatically and has seized political power.
I'm going to go to Nagma in 1 second. I think because we're a little bit behind schedule, partially maybe because of my long opening question, I think I'll let us go for about 10 minutes past if you guys are okay with that, and that'll give us a little bit more time to answer some questions. Um,
Right.
Nagma, let me pass this over to you. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Anang said. I'm just gonna like kind of add a little bit to that, and because there's so many questions and ideas left. But I would say, one of the things, just kind of evidence for one of the things that Anang said, one of the things that we do know, even though we can't contact our families, even though, that there is the internet is down. One of the consequences of that, and this we know when we talk to our families on the phone, is that people are watching two news channels. They're either watching the Islamic Republic of Iran's broadcasting, or they're watching Iran International, which is basically is like the Fox News of a particular way of thinking about Iran. And that matters, right? That matters because going back to what Arang says, when we think about the diversity of the diaspora, we need to also think about the unequalness of certain resources. What part of the diaspora are more in what sections, right? There's another part of the diaspora that's represented primarily in academia, right? I mean, these are all part and parcel of the question of what is the diaspora, but not having a media arm, as for example, the monarchists do with Iran International, does have some kind of effect. Having said that, I do think we need to just, when we're thinking about inside Iran, ask ourselves, and I don't have the answer for it, but we should be skeptical, or ask ourselves at least, to what degree are people inside Iran instrumentalizing the diaspora in their connection to it, right? And so we think if people shout Pahlavi, then forever and a day people are monarchists. Maybe they are, but maybe also they are looking for a way out of a predicament. And this particular voice in diaspora is offering a particular type of solution that fits that moment. But once that moment goes away, maybe a different voice from the inside, from the outside, become a part of it. And I just want to say something. I'm repeating something that I want somebody has already said. Which is not here, but I'm just totally blanking on her name, and I'm so sorry to her for having that. But one of the things she says is that just keeping in mind that an idea of republicanism is going to be multiple, right? It's going to be diverse. And going back to what Orang said earlier about the Islamic Republic, is going to have multiplicity of voices and debates within it. That becomes a more difficult idea to kind of wholesale travel into a space that is going through a crisis. But there are attempts by people to do that. One of the things that has been happening still is there's an attempt right now by those who are called themselves Republicans to bring in outside forces with inside support. So not we don't know who they are on the inside, but the people on the outside are saying that they are basically speaking for them at this moment, and that when the situation changes, they'll reveal themselves. And I just mean to say what Orang said, absolutely, but we do have to kind of keep in mind how the diaspora can be a solution at one point, but it can also not be a solution at another point. It's a dynamic situation.
Um, Something that maybe flows out of this conversation about the diaspora is it's hard to have these conversations about Iran, I think, without thinking about the role. I mean, obviously, America is playing a very big role in physically reshaping Iran for the worse at the moment. But so much of our understanding of what's happening in Iran in the Anglosphere is filtered through it's politics, rhetoric, discourse of the United States. And one of the things, obviously, that has elevated the diaspora, made the diaspora a significant player, is something that the Georgetown scholar Femi Taiwo calls deference epistemology, right? This sort of idea that, well, look, we should listen to Iranians,
Mhm.
which I think is that's a nice thought, but obviously poses the question, well, which Iranians are we going to listen to? Um, I wonder how you guys think about this question of representing Iran, or the views from Iran that are represented outside the country, and maybe in particular with an eye toward um, uh, people who see the Islamic Republic as a bulwark against American imperialism, as a country that right, like literally is being destroyed by America, or America is trying to destroy it. How do you think through that logic of um, the diaspora, or anti-regime forces in the diaspora, and the regime, and how people outside, probably both Iranians and non-Iranians, get sort of tied up in knots trying to figure out who are the good guys here, or where should I stand, or who should I listen to?
Nachman, do you want to go first?
No,
Or
I think you should go.
Okay, no one wants this question. Go ahead, Aron.
um, yeah, it's obviously been this is an important question of how to, as progressives, wanting um, to challenge, you know, uh, these hegemonic forces, but also be cognizant that there are Iranians who literally took to the streets and put their lives on the line just 6 weeks ago. That is a hard, for some people, it's become a hard circle to square. Um, you know, I don't think it's personally that difficult. I mean, we have to. I mean, first of all, it's about a bit about your positionality. I would say, as someone who's in the United States, where my tax dollars are going to a war machine and have for decades at this point, I do take seriously that I have my little bit of voice, that I have my position as a university professor. I do have to call the United States out on its war making, and for decades, and its support for genocide 2, 3 years ago, and ongoing genocide, so forth. So I take that role seriously. However, when I just the other day, when a very good, serious student said, "Look, but the primary task right now is empire, and Iranians can solve their battles and their contradictions, social contradictions later." I'm like, you can't just partition that out. That's exactly, in a sense, what the Islamic Republic is saying. It's like there's no space for you to debate, to organize right now because we're in a war situation, right? And I just, this is a proverbial situation where you can and should fight both battles. But going back to the point is to make, part of the challenge is that Iran, because of the repression, Iranians haven't been able to organize associations and unions and political parties to represent their interests, right? If they were, we could say, oh, I support this political party or this student or this teachers organizations in Esfahan or Tehran, right? And that would be the ideal scenario. But because of the repression, we don't have like very specific parties or associations or women's groups to do. We have some, but we don't have enough of them, or we don't have ones that really scale up to the national level. And that makes it difficult to say, yes, these are the Iranian voices that I am in solidarity with. So it makes it harder to do that. And for your members on this call, it is challenging. That's why you really do have to steep yourself and into this, into understanding all of Iran and the varieties of Iran that are jostling for space at this moment.
Nagma, this is your one of your projects, I think. Tell us a bit. I mean, obviously for you guys, it's you're not necessarily saying who are the good guys. That's obviously a bit oversimple. But how do you think about um, people who are torn about this?
Um, Yeah, can I I'll answer that
Yeah, you
question,
go
but
back.
just
You don't
like
have to
as
answer
a
my
kind of
my
like
actual.
once,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
no, I want to, but I just want to say, I'm very perplexed that this is such a dilemma and conundrum for many people. And I say that because, one of the things I talked about talking to a student, one of the things when I teach grad students in history and reading historical texts, one of the things we talk about is if you come across something in a text that you do not understand, the reaction to that is not to reject it or to just take it. The reaction to that should be to ask yourself, why do I not understand it? Right. And in that puzzling about why there's a distance between what I think this text should say and what the text actually is trying to say, that space is a generative space, right? It's a space in which ideas come out and it's illuminating. That's when you really understand what a historical text is saying. It not just history, right? The role that jokes play, for example, in any society, right? If you're not from there, you don't get the joke. But if you get the joke, that means you've gained access into that society. And I say that to say, look, I mean, here's a fact. The fact is that there are people in Iran are simultaneously sometimes against the government and against the war. Sometimes one day it's against the war, one day it's against the government. Sometimes it's never against the government, you know, pro-government. That doesn't happen. But I mean to say there are permutations, and it's a fact. So why don't we, instead of saying, but how can that be? Just try to understand something that has happened. It's not like we're trying to come up with an imaginary thing. People are both anti-Islamic Republic and against this US-Israeli war. A fact. If we sit down and think about it, then what are we understanding about A, where Iranian society is, but also what questions of solidarity, what questions of politics, what it means to be politically active in an environment like that mean, right? And I just say that because it sometimes gets very it becomes almost a digression trying to say, well, you know, like I'm anti-imperialist and like I don't understand what's going on. Well, somebody else in Iran is anti-imperialist and anti-Islamic Republic. So let's start from a given, the data that we do have, and then start thinking about it as to say, what are the conditions that made this thing that looks contradictory to me, but it does not feel contradictory to the person in that environment? What are the conditions that made that? And then we can perhaps get a better answer than just either wholesale adopting or wholesale rejecting other people's positions. And this is not deference, right? It's actually quite the opposite of it. This is taking people's positions and their politics and their ideas seriously, even if I don't quite understand it. And that, to me, is there's a difference between that and the question of deference.
Can I ask you, that's a very good answer. Can I ask you though, what do you think, because this is so much of what you do on your Substack, are there ways for people to get a better understanding of, obviously the internet is down, people are not being able to speak, but what if someone who was on this call said, look, I want to understand these various political currents in Iran, or as Arang said, you know, whom could I be in solidarity with? Is it a teachers movement? Is it a student movement? What's the best way, or what could allow people to get a better sense of the richness and diversity of these opinions that are inside Iran?
I mean, thankfully we live in a world in which you can take a text in a language you don't understand and run it through a software, and it gives you a verbal translation, right? So, what I do in my Substack, I try to kind of give a background and kind of give an annotation so that it makes sense in the framework. But if you were interested in hearing voices that are being produced inside Iran. There's newspapers that are being published that you can just run through AI and just read them. So like there's a very simple point there. But I think this goes back to the conversation Orang and I have been having since 2 o'clock, which is that we need to let go, I think, of the framings that we are married to when it comes to understanding both Iranian state and Iranian society, right? We need to kind of say, what are the ways in which we can bring nuance to that framing? Because access to the primary sources is actually not hard. I can give you a list of 10, you put them through AI, you'll read them. But to understand what they mean, we do have to kind of tweak the way in which we think about the past 47 years of the Islamic Republic, starting with not thinking that we're talking about just one thing, which is how we started it out with.
Is that,
But Arang, do you want
do
to
you
add to
feel,
that?
well, Nagma, do you feel hopeful about that, given the level of sort of discourse in America and elsewhere about the reality of life in Iran?
I have been shocked that out of all of this pain and misery and tragedy and suffering, I have discovered that I'm both a cynic and an optimist, which is a very strange thing to be. Um, so I wouldn't say look, you have to be hopeful. Let me put it this way. I've been thinking, trying to do what I said before, which is one of the things I was trying to figure out is how is it that some of the voices that come out of Iran they're simultaneously, it's like, oh my God, we're gonna die because of the bombardment. And then when a bomb falls, people go into the roof and cheer. Like, how does that work? And one of the things that I've thought about is I've thought about my own experiences of when we lived in Iran during the war. And I haven't repressed it, but it's not an experience that I like to take around for a walk often. But one of the things I realize is that you have to always be hopeful in that kind of situation. Nobody in the reality of a bomb falling on their head is actually sitting down and saying, well, this bomb, is gonna hit me and live in that space of pessimism. Everybody is thinking, okay, this bomb is not going to hit me. I hope it doesn't hit me. I hope it doesn't hit my family. And in a weird way, therefore, this moment of war does create, you have to hold hope inside of it. Like it just presents itself. There's no way out of that. And so it's not that I'm hopeful. I think we're in a position that, again, is simultaneously deeply tragic, deeply uncertain, deeply painful. But hope is just caked into it because we're humans. What else are you going to be?
Well, I've put, Nagma, your last post from a few days ago, where you talked about, you mentioned a blog post by the editor of Shark, and you mentioned your childhood memories. Arang, I'm going to leave you our last question,
Oh,
or to follow on from what Nagma has said, and I'm just going to add in one question from the audience that you can fold
sure,
in, which
sure.
is, um, what we could say about after January 8th, I think you would have said, or people would have said that the regime was at a low ebb in terms of its public popularity and its legitimacy. Um, Someone is asking, how has the war change that, or how is the war likely to affect that? I suspect it's not amenable to a simple answer, but feel free to pick up on what Nagma has just said. I mean, it does occur to me.
Yeah.
There's an old joke that war is God's way of teaching Americans geography. Um, it does occur to me that maybe this is a moment when a better kind of discourse in the Anglosphere about Iran will come into being out of this tragedy. But I'll leave it to you, Arne.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I like that last point. I mean, I will say, in this past, let's say, 3 months, and gradually over the past few years, one thing I have been struck is that, obviously not all outlets have the same thing, but more and more outlets have a more diverse set of Iran expert voices. It's a real sea change. Young journalists who are doing great reporting, who read Persian, using the latest skills, diverse array of academic voices. Nagma's blog is there, but there are other people in the Nation and other outlets who are doing a lot of this, capturing the diverse voices in Iran. So I think we're actually in a lot better place than we were, for instance, in 2009 when I came back from Iran, and there really were just the same old voices just repeating their little framework for Iran. So I think this is to be hopeful. The Anglosphere is actually, for lack of a better term, is sort of matured as well. Um, so I think that's something positive. One little point I just wanted to make is that for our friends that want to think about the Islamic Republic as a state that sovereignty needs to be protected as an anti-imperialist force, I do really, one of my first responses is always to remind them that the Islamic Republic is a state that operates within capitalism and is a capitalist state ultimately. And so we have to grapple with class relations within. And once you start, like for instance, this wonderful essay by Ida Niku in Merap that we can maybe I'll put in the chat. She really unpacks how capitalism works in Iran with sanctions, but also with this privatization and austerity that I talked about. So we have to, our friends on, they want to take that view. Have to really grapple with how capitalism works through the Iranian system. But I'm sorry, you had a very specific question that I now
Oh
lost.
well, just about is the war going to be a lifeline
Oh,
to the legitimacy of the regime? I suppose. I mean,
yeah.
that's as good of a place as any to end.
On February 27th, now that I know the date, I would have said yes, the regime was actually both simultaneously strong and vicious and powerful and vengeful and mowed down its own people, but simultaneously weak because the only tool it has now had was violence. There's no consent, no co-opting, no alliance building, right? All of those resources that it had in the 1980s, 1990s to draw people, to educate people, right? The reason that you have such a large intelligentsia in Iran is that because in the 1980s and 1990s, Iranians were massively educated, right? So you have this broadening of society, and you could build like forms of consensus and pathways for participation. All of that has shrunk, and all they had was the violence. Another tragedy of this war is that now that violence, we'll see how it plays out. Who knows? Wars are unpredictable, but in a sense, the regime and its coercive apparatus has been given a new lease on life. Um, that Iranians are going to will confront somehow or not, but it is a regime in the past 8 days that its strengths have been recharged, relegitimated because it's protecting. And if those of you watch Iranian TV, I mean, I was just before this, I was watching some of these scenes that they were covering the images of these apartment buildings shot and destroyed. It's going that argument that we're here to protect you. If we're not here, Israelis and U.S. warships and tanks will be on the streets of Tehran. That argument is going to have a few more followers, a few more supporters, a few more people that it's going to be sympathetic to, which is not which is not great.
And can
Um,
I just add one
yeah,
thing
go
that
ahead,
gets
Nagma.
to
Yeah, yeah.
your point that you made, Anang, which is that we have to remember as, I mean, I'm not going to name it, but we know that in the darkness of the internet, they have been rounding up intellectuals. There have been beatings. There have been interrogations. So that whole, this is the one tool, but now they can move it forward in a way that is energized, let's put it, even that more than before, is happening, but we just don't have that direct access because of the internet blackout.
I could go on for a long time, but I think everyone probably has to carry on with their days. I'm so grateful to Arang and to Nagma. This has been a fantastic conversation. I apologize for any oversimplifications that I may have introduced in my questions. I've put various things in the chat. Go check out Nagma's Substack, which is fantastic. Read Arang's lovely piece in the New York Review, and come to equator.org and sign up, and we'll be putting more events like this on in the future. So thank you to everyone for coming. Thank you to my panelists, and I think this recording will be on YouTube at some point. We'll send an email hopefully and notify people who want to share it around. So thank you again to
Thank
everyone,
you for
and good night.
having us. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you,
Bye.
Jonathan, and everyone else. Thank you. I,
I'm just going to put one last thing here in the chat for anyone who's
oh,
this MEREP article I've got here. It's the one called "Governing Crisis, Sanctions, Austerity, and Social Unrest."
absolutely,
Fantastic.
a great read.
Thank you, Arang. Have a good night.
Bye bye.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you for coming. See you soon.